Hey LS Church, we're starting a new podcast where we sit down with Sunday's speaker and recap their message with questions and conversation. This week's pod is on March 23rd's message, Don't Forget to Remember, with Pastor Rod Anderson. Let's check it out. What's up LS Church? My name's Caden and I'm here with Pastor Rod, and we are doing the Sunday Recap Podcast where we do just that. We recap Sunday's message. And this Sunday was March 23rd and Pastor Rod spoke on Don't Forget to Remember. And so this is Pastor Rod's first time on the podcast. This is the Rodcast, if you will.
He's been waiting a long time to say that one.
I have, very much so. So let's jump right into it. So we've been talking about remembrance a lot this month, really, ever since March started, because we started off with our 50th anniversary service. Right. And speaking of 50th anniversary service, you've been here for how many of the 50 years?
45 of the 50 years.
45, yeah. So you are, some would say, a for-lifer. Also, a nickname that is just trending through our staff for you is the Oak, because you just stand strong.
I didn't come up with that one.
So maybe just for a minute before we jump into the message, kind of talk about how you started at the church and then maybe your roles going through as long as you've been here.
Okay. I came to the church. My family came here in 1980.
Mm-hmm.
I was just a kid in junior high at that time. And so I kind of grew up in the youth group.
Mm-hmm.
I was very involved in the youth group. That was just some great experiences through that time. And the day I stopped being one of the members of the youth group, I became a youth worker.
Yeah.
And I stayed in that for a long time. I even taught at the school for 3 years while I was in college. Went out in the business world and came back. I was still involved in the church the whole time, but then I came on staff full-time in 1994.
Mm-hmm.
We were still building Victory Camp at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So the camp director, Kevin Kinchin, asked me to come on staff. So I've been here ever since then. I was his right-hand man. I eventually became the camp director, very
Mm-hmm.
involved in that. And I'm also serving over here at the church, whether that's, administration or obviously preaching on a Sunday or doing a continuing ed. I've just had different roles throughout the years, but obviously this place means a lot to me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And and your wife, Shauna, she works here, and your daughter, Bailey's a whole family thing.
Pretty good.
So pretty
cool.
Good,
yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So there's a lot of great things for you to remember of what God's done in your life, and that, bringing it back to the message, you talk about, can we remember, what God has done for us, but also, if not just as important, but equally as important, or a little bit less, whatever you'd say, is to forget, about, some things that we need to forget about and, quit holding on to. When you talk about, you open it up with kind of 6 R's. Pastor Steph loves the alliteration, so you matched it and you had the R's. So I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of read the sentences, and then maybe point to one of the things you talk about. Maybe you can just throw a couple words to unpack that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
But so you start off with recalling what God has done for us, and then you talked about the memorial stones, right? So what is a good way, maybe a way that in the Bible that we saw people recalling what God's done for us, and then something that maybe what we can start thinking of to recall.
Well, if we use the example of the memorial stones, that's when they had crossed the Jordan, and God wanted them to stack the stones there, one from each tribe, so that every time they came through there, they could remember the miracle that God had done for helping the Israelites to cross the Jordan at that time. And it was just something to put before their eyes every time they came through, and it was also there for future generations.
Yeah.
So that the story wouldn't be forgotten.
Right.
And I think that it's important in our lives that there's things that we do that is something that helps us to remember and others around us to remember. Obviously we're not out there stacking memorial stones, but just something that we can do in our life to remember. Because every time that they would go past and see those stones, it's them remembering what God had done and keeping it fresh in our minds. And even though we have all had miraculous things that God's done for us, sometimes we don't remember them as much as we should.
Right. Yeah. It makes me think of, you've been in a million camp services, so, and I know at least as many as I've been in, which is, over the past 12 years, I guess, of especially Victory Camp, is that I feel like we always get like mementos sometimes, when we'll do staff training for all the people that work there before camp starts. We'll be like, hey, going into this summer, let's do this activation, right? And so maybe it's a little keychain that you can get to remember. Even this 50th anniversary, we handed out keychains so they can remember. But those are even like, I guess you would say small memorial stones, so to say, of like, remember what God did in your life. And too, as well, you know, they always say, write it down. Someone has a prophetic word for you, you know, write it down. If you have an encounter with God, write it down. Just because, you know, how important that is. I just figured you'd seen that a million times. You know, you've seen it through all those services.
Yeah.
So
yeah, for sure.
So that was good. So recalling what God did for us, and then, like you said, the stones. And then the next one was, it reinforces our faith. That's why it's important to remember. And you talk about, I think it was counting the stars. Right? Was it Abraham when he was talking about to count the stars?
Whenever he was struggling, which obviously if you know the story of Abraham, you know, that was a long period of time between when he got the promise and his son was born. And so God would tell him to go out there and count the stars in the sky, or to think of the sands by the sea. And he said, that's what I'm promising to you. So it would cause him to go back to remembering the promise, not in the middle of what he was in at that time, which was struggling to have a child. Right.
And then you think of him in that moment, like, or you think of him throughout all the time, like anytime he was by the sea, he'd be reminded, you know, anytime it was nighttime, which is every day, he'd be reminded. I feel like that's a great practice just for people to, you know, remember what God's promises. What are some ways maybe that, you know, people that want to remember those promises, what are ways that we can set those things up in our lives to remind us, you know?
Well, I think one of the things is staying in His Word. When you're reading the Bible all the time, the Bible is full of promises.
Yeah.
You know, some of their promises are available to all of us. So if we can even see in those promises, or read examples in the Bible of when promises are fulfilled, that helps to build our faith.
Right.
And I think it's good to do those things and just to remember what happened. You know, obviously for Abraham, it was the promise coming. Sometimes it's us just thinking about, is there a promise in our past that we can go back to that God fulfilled that gives us faith for the next one that He's promised to us?
Right. Yeah, that's good. That's really good. And so your next point was it rehearses, you know, us rehearsing our testimony. And this is going to maybe make you really think about it, but how many times have you told a testimony that you can like how many, if you can name the time of how many times you've shared with somebody something that God's done in your life?
Oh man, there's no way to count, because sometimes it's just a little piece of your testimony. Sometimes it might be years and years of your story, but there's so many times when I've talked to people and maybe it's something they're struggling with, and I know that if I can give them a small piece of my testimony, it may help them in that situation. And it's amazing. If you're conscious in rehearsing your testimony or sharing your testimony, God's going to open the doors for you to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's good. And I think what you said there was good too, is that, you know, it's not all, you know, we always talk about Pastor Al's testimony, right? Because his is the classic poster of a testimony, like, I got shot this many times, you know, God's completely delivered me from something. But I think that's important too, just being like, you know, a small thing of like, I needed a front row at grocery store. I needed a front row parking spot at the grocery store. And I prayed, and as soon as I turned the corner, there was that, like, even that can build faith for people. You know, it can be as small as that. And so you talked about, you know, sharing the testimony. Is there any time that someone shared a testimony with you? I just want to ask you stories. That's all I want to do. But is there any time someone has shared a testimony with you that really ignited your faith, or, you know, like one that you can remember, maybe not what it was, but who it was that really shared it with you and like it ignited you?
I think sometimes even it was maybe people that I could have considered mentors in my life. They would talk about something that God had done in their life. Because I could look at that and say, I see where that person's at now, and them telling me that testimony tells me where they came from. If God can do it for them, He can do it for me.
That's good.
And I think that's, I've just kind of taken those little, and it's the same thing. It may have just been a little nugget to them, but to me, it was huge. And so I just kind of take those things and hold on to them.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like, you know, that's even encouragement for everyone listening. If you have something, like, just realize that, you know, if God did something in your life, like, you know, don't be selfish with it, right? Like, you share that, because that does, you know, like it's one of your other points was like, it reinforces our faith knowing that. So one of your next points, which is, I would say the one that you probably spent the most time on, it's the R that you spent the most time on, was the renew, and it strengthens our trust in Him. You talk about Joseph's story, and the story of Joseph. So I love that story just because, it goes from, for lack of better words, rags to riches, but like through so many different, like, because you even think about where he started. Like he started as, the son of Israel in a pretty great household, so to say, and then sold into slavery, and then, put up like so many highs and lows, right? Then sent to prison.
It wasn't just one time down and then he was back up and it was great.
Right.
There were ups and downs in between.
Right. So then, it makes you think like, our lives and our story, when we think that this is it at this point in our life, but then there's a low and you think, well, now I'm here and I can only see, but I think it was funny. One of the phrases that I thought of when you were talking about Joseph was playing the long game, like Joseph really was like, had that faith and he really held on to it. And I just think that's so important too, just because of, us being able to hold on to what, like you said, what God has promised us, right? And, in every situation, no matter what it is, like revisit that because it can renew you when you need it.
Yes.
There's been times, where all of us have been low and we need to look up at this promise that, God has to renew our strength. But I thought I think that you spent maybe a couple minutes on each one, and that one you had like 10 minutes on, just because that story just needs so much unpacking too.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, it's just like you were saying, it wasn't just one little thing. It was so many ups and downs, and his trust in God in the middle of that. He had to somehow be hanging on to that promise that came through those dreams,
right?
In spite of, it's pretty bad despair. You're in prison, and you're not just in prison for a few days. You're in there for years.
Yeah.
And, just to be able to trust God through that he somehow was going to fulfill that promise.
Right. And not to mention that he didn't do anything. That's
yes,
the all of those. Yeah. Okay. So the next one you had, the second to last one was it redirects us on the path, following the plans, God has for us, because you talk about sometimes we go the wrong way. How can we, once we're going the wrong way, number one, how do we realize that we are? And then number two, how can we remember to have it redirect us?
Yeah. Well, the only way you're going to know if you're going the wrong way is looking at where he wants you to go.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's just us taking our eyes off of him. Just like if you take your eyes off the road when you're driving a car, you're either going to end up off the road in the ditch or you're going to make a wrong turn somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think it's really just keeping an eye on him. And when we can stay focused on him, it's the same as, I know I use this analogy of the car. If you're keeping your eyes ahead on the road, that's where you're going to get to. You're not looking 10 feet in front of you. You're looking down the road because that's where you're eventually trying to get to.
Right.
And I think so many times in our life, we tend to get away from that. We're looking so much at what's around us, which is our circumstances, that we start going on the wrong path and we get away from what God wants us to do. So you just got to do some course correction in there.
Right. Yeah, that's good. And then your last point is it reminds us of the freedom that we're walking in. And I think that kind of ties it back to what this whole year is. This whole year has been us talking about freedom, and how, we've been in bondage, some things of the world, and the enemy, and sometimes it's just us, you know what I mean? Like we put ourselves in bondage, just because that we have freedom and it's right there for us to grab it. But, it's comfortable, I guess, right? It's just comfortable to be able to sit in, what we know, which it is, so to say, slavery in that way. So I think that's really good, and it ties kind of both like the remembrance and freedom that we've been in the past couple of months. Yeah. Past couple of months. And then you talk about the types of, you have a couple of memory triggers that you were kind of talking about.
Right.
And so one of them was the audible. And I guess you sharing. So why do you share some of these memory triggers?
Well, I just want people to understand the ways that we remember things. So I use obviously the example of being able to recall something from a song,
right?
And the repetition that comes with that, because you're hearing it over and over and over. Or,
right.
Or I use the example of using being able to quote the VIN of my car,
right?
And it was because I had put it into a computer so many times,
yeah.
So I was typing it in,
yeah.
And I was seeing it at the same time. To understand that those are tools that we can use. God has given us this mind that can help us to remember the things that we need to, whether
right.
it's a scripture he's trying to show us or something that we want to listen to over and over and over that's going to, excuse me, that's going to kind of build our faith.
Right.
I wanted people to understand that that's something that he's built into our minds to be able to do that.
Right. And those are just some ways to do it. Like you said, like you want to hear it over and over again. So that means you might have to say it over and over again. And then same thing, writing it down. Like you write down that verse every single day. So, I think it's funny too, because you talk about, significant memories like moving day, right? Like, there's significant memories where you feel like, you've been set free too. Those are good things to remember. And you talk about not so good memories. And my question is, why do those seem to be the ones that we can remember? When people talk about laying in bed at night being like, why did I do that when I was 12 years old and I'm embarrassed of myself? Like, why are those the ones that we focus on?
I think so many times it's because of the pain that's there with it. It's when there's pain, it's just one of those things that's going to grab your attention more than something else. If you go through a regular old day, you don't remember much of what you've done that day. If something big happened that day sticks with you for a little bit longer.
Right.
And so I think it's just easy to grab those things and hang on to them. Maybe it is the regret that comes with it.
Right.
I wish I wouldn't have done that. The guilt, just the whatever kind of things it triggers in your life, like depression or anything else, those things just make it easier to hang on to that because whether you're trying to fix it in your mind or whatever the case may be.
Right. So. And you have a good quote right after that, which is, we remember what we should forget and we forget what we should remember. And that's just human nature. It is sometimes it gives your, I guess I would say your flesh, but it gives the false imitation of life when you have drama to talk about or past hurt to talk about, because sometimes we glorify it. We glorify that in society about different. I've this has happened to me, and I'm this because of this, and we sometimes define ourselves by things that have happened to us. And so, I think that's a good thing to do is to really, Pastor has been talking about the mind recently and taking thoughts captive. Like, let's think about the things that we're even remembering. Like, is that worth holding here and revisiting all the time, or do we need to replace that with something else that God's done? And I think a lot of that too, that could trigger that, like you said, is looking back and going and looking and try to find, when we did the 50th anniversary things, everyone was doing research, right? But it was cool because it ignited faith, because you're like, oh my goodness, that did happen. And that you wouldn't have that faith ignited if you didn't look back. You didn't go and do the research yourself. And that's just what's happened here. Nevertheless, what's happened in our lives. That's why I like looking through my Photos app on my phone, because I can go through and look at stuff and be like, I remember where I was here. I remember what I was thinking here. I don't know if you keep a journal or not ever, but it's funny to look at myself writing journal passages even 3 years ago. I'm like, oh my gosh, that was such an immature way to think, because God's delivered us so much from, in mindsets and things that we believe that really hold a strong hold over us. There's always the joke about teenagers in high school. And the biggest thing is, what are you going to wear to prom? You know what I mean? Like that's the biggest thing that you have. But that's funny because that takes space on what we remember. That's like is the pinnacle of what we're worried about. And so it's funny to look back and see, maturing even ways that we've grown and what God's helped us walk through. So, and then you talk about the children of Israel, and it's so funny when we compare ourselves to the children of Israel, because it's so funny to look at them and point and be like, I can't believe y'all did that. But then you flip it and you're like, we're technically doing that right now, And so maybe talk about for a minute on why the children of Israel are compared to us when it comes to remembering and taking for granted, what God's doing in our lives right now.
Well, I think some of it goes back to what you said a few minutes ago. Some of that is human nature. That's just the state of man that we are, ever since the fall of Adam. And I think it's just that lots of times you can get comfortable and I know this sounds strange, but it's true. You can get comfortable being in that bad spot. It's easier just to wallow in that than it is to take the effort to try to move forward and get out of that. And it had gotten to the point for them that it had actually twisted their perspective when they were talking about how great it was when we were in Egypt and they had pots of meat and bread. And it's like, yeah, but you're also under the control of a taskmaster every day, brutal labor, And the leader of that country was trying to wipe out the population right there under your noses. So you forgot that part in your little thing when you're complaining to Moses. It's just amazing. But like you said, we can point at it's like, these people are ridiculous. And you're like, oh yeah, I probably did something like that already this week. So, it's just how we are.
Right. It's funny because you even say like, they talk about it like it's the good old days. And it's like, what, slavery? Those are the good old days, but your mind can play tricks on you if you let it. They talk about how many great things that God, did for them and provided for them, like daily manna every single day. They were able to provide that, but they took that for granted. They were lost, but they were they were guided by a cloud by day, fire by night. So it's just funny because, you look at it, but of course hindsight, right? We can look at it and read it and be like, oh my goodness, like you guys had this opportunity and this opportunity, this opportunity. And I wonder if someone's looking at our lives right now and saying the same thing, right? For us, right? Because we're like, oh, well, if you were in it and you were, so to say, a child of Israel, and you were being led out of that into the wilderness, I wonder what our mindset would be. Would we, adapt to what they were all thinking as well? Because I don't know if it would be as easy, right? Yeah. So I also thought it was what I was talking about, or when you said, the good old days, right? The glorifying, being in captivity. Why do we glorify the days that we were in bondage? How can we get to that mindset of, maybe you spoke on it a little bit about, maybe it's comfort, or what is it that makes us glorify those things? It's almost like Stockholm syndrome, you've actually fallen in love with your captor. Like why is that?
Well, for a lot of and I hate using human nature over and over, but sometimes it's just easier to wallow in the self-pity of it. Look at yourself as a victim and whatever the case may be. And like I said before, to go and try to get past whatever that hurdle is in our lives, sometimes we're just looking at, that's a lot of effort. It is just easier where I'm at. I'll still be okay, and it's just easier to stay where I am instead of trying to get out of that. Yeah. Lots of times it's what we do. You get the herd instinct with that same time. Yeah. You start doing that together. You start sharing each other's woes and troubles, and it actually amplifies it. Yeah. It makes it tougher to get out of there. Yeah. And we as human beings, being the social creatures we are, we make that very easy to do. Yeah, it makes me think like, you talk about like, at work, the water cooler conversations, like how many of those things are talking about good stuff? Yeah, what's productive? Right, what's productive? How many times are we having those conversations being like, well, this has happened to me again, and we bond through that, right? Like if we go to a social event, like why is that the funny thing or why is that the comforting thing to share with each other? Like what's going on in your life? Well, let me just share you all the bad things, right? It's funny because even when somebody does come in with a good mentality, like how are things going for you? Well, God has blessed me in this, and then sometimes we're like, oh, brother, and we're like, I don't want to hear any of that because we don't like it because we have a hard time believing it, and it's just funny how that ends up being the case for us, right? Yeah, for sure. The next thing you start talking about is some different things that we should forget, right? And you start talking about Peter. How is Peter a good example of forgetting failure? Well, we read so much about Peter because part of it, you could say it was his personality, but obviously there's a lot documented that Peter did. Yeah. So he was producing one way or the other, good or bad, in his walk with God, walk with Jesus. And I just think for him, he was so intent, and I don't know if it was because he was trying to prove himself, whatever it was, is that he was going to be the man of the hour for Jesus. And when Jesus puts him in his place by saying, you're going to deny me 3 times, I just wonder, because Jesus didn't say that to him and then just walk away. Yeah. There's several chapters after that where he's still talking to the disciples, but I wonder what happened to Peter's mindset if his brain or his ears just clicked off to what Jesus was saying the rest of that time, and he was locked in on that. Right. And like I said, when I was talking about this on Sunday, that was really the kind of the final encounter that we know of that he had with Jesus before Jesus died on the cross. Right. So once Jesus died on the cross, where was Peter's head after that?
Right.
Was he like, wow, I really did fail, just like he said, and I can't fix it now? Now, obviously, we know that, rose from the dead, and you read further in John, it talks about it. But I just think that that's a pretty good example of where we can be. His words were the ones he heard from Jesus, but it can be anybody in our lives that shares like that. That's something that doesn't, I'm not saying it puts us down, but it's something that maybe gets us, we allow ourselves to get into the wrong mindset.
Yeah.
Fortunately, redemption came when Jesus came back and he said, no, I am actually commissioning you, which led to all the great things that he did in the book of Acts when Jesus was gone. But it was just, I just thought of that because this was somebody that was serving him, had such a massive failure, and then to come back from that and be restored in that relationship with Jesus and to fulfill what Jesus had called him to do, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely Jesus being able to, we'll get to it later because you kind of closed with this, but like the way that Jesus reconciled that whole situation is so good. But I'm going to ask you some questions that are going to be, some would say, ridiculous questions, but I think that they need to, be answered because we can justify these feelings. But my first question is why? You talk about forgetting offense. Why should we forget offense?
Well, I said this the other day. Whenever we're remembering something, that is the thing that is taking up the resources in our mind. And if we're taking on those offenses, that's occupying our mind space and not being able to focus on good things. But second of all, if you take something like some offense that somebody, it may even be something that they didn't even intentionally do it to you, but you take an offense for whatever reason. If you allow those things to sit there and grow, it eventually turns into bitterness. And what it's done, it's taken you down a path. And if you think about it, whoever offended you, it probably has no impact on that person.
Yeah.
But it has taken you in the wrong direction because of what you started to remember.
Yeah.
And we want to get away from it because those are things, man, the devil's going to try to throw those out there all the time because he knows if those can occupy your mind space, then the things that should be in there.
It's just distracting,
Yes.
And it even makes me think of the phrase, the old saying, I don't know where it's from, but it's having offense or holding a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for someone else to die, right? If you offend me, well, me holding a grudge against you, like if I never share with you, if I never try to reconcile it, or if I even, don't even just try to just, let it just, go over my head like it doesn't even do anything, like I'm the one who's, like you said, like tearing myself apart about what you did to me, and you're like, hey, Caden, how's everything going? It doesn't even affect you. So yeah, I think that's good. Next one is oppression and depression. Now those may be like, what if someone's asking, I would love to forget depression, but it's hard. Like, what would you say to somebody that would say that?
Well, anything that comes in like that, there's something that caused that.
Yeah.
And so if you can get to the source of what that is something that you can get out of your life. It's not something, it doesn't need to become a lifestyle to you.
Yeah.
Even oppression. Now, I know lots that we kind of go into the spiritual side of it. If there's something in the spirit realm that's causing oppression, whatever it may be, those are just things. If you think about oppression, it's something that's grabbing hold of you.
Right.
Depression, it's almost like it's something that's almost like it's almost hovering like a shadow or something over you, and it's almost get to the point where it's something that you wear.
Yeah.
And we want to get away from those things. We want to shed those things because if it's anything like that, it goes back to what you were saying a minute ago. It's something that's hindering us.
Yeah.
And we don't want those things.
Right. Yeah, for sure. That's good. I like that even too. Like, oppression is something that's holding on to you, and depression is maybe something that you wear, right? And like you said, we want to shed those things off, and remembrance can be like you said, can get you, I think of the song, Cato sings it on Sundays a lot, but it's like, I put off all the heaviness, I put on a garment of praise, right? Like that can replace that, praising God for, what he's done in your life can, like you said, let's say you're wearing a jacket of, something that has, really a heavy emotion that's held on to you because of a past hurt or something. You exchange that, right? For this thank you and this gratitude. That's good. And then the last, I think one of the last things you say about, something you forget is rejection. Why do we need to forget rejection?
Well, and this goes back to that's why I shared the story of Peter. Rejection tells us that, and I know I talked about failure with him too, but lots of times rejection just tells us that we're not worthy of whatever it may be in that case. And if we allow that mindset to develop, it's like, well, I'm not worthy of doing anything then. Let's just think of it in our walk with God. Well, I've been rejected in this area, and maybe it's just through something a person told me, but now that I think about it, I guess I'm really not worthy of doing anything for him. And it's just like the other things. It's something that gets in there and occupies your mind space, and then you're allowing, you'll start to allow habits and attitudes develop out of that, and we don't want to allow that to get in there.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I feel like that's a big thing, in that rejection phase, because then once you are rejected, like you said. Even when it comes to Peter and that conversation Peter had, was his mind turned off to everything else? Once we are rejected, do we turn our minds off to everything else that maybe God has for us, that He still wants to pour into us, or any good things that happen? You just hold on to that bitterness, and that's actually all you focus on. So then after that, you go into alliteration again, and you say,
hey, I did it twice.
Here are the 6 C's on why we should forget some things. And so the first one you kind of addressed when we talked about forgetting failure and offense, but the first thing on why we should forget some things is that they crowd out the good things in our minds. And it made me think about Yelp reviews or Google reviews. It makes me think of when you look at reviews on places, how many times are they just negative, right?
Yeah.
And I just think that's funny. Why is it so important to flood, let's say, the reviews of things in our lives with good reviews over negative reviews? Why is that important?
Well, I said we're always going to remember something. That's the way that we're built.
Right.
Our minds are always remembering something. And second of all, there's a limited amount of resources that we can devote in our mind to remembering things.
Yeah.
And so we need to pick the good over the bad.
Yeah.
And it's when we allow those bad things to get in there, and they start taking up the resources, all the good's trying to get in there, and there's just no room for it.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't get its proper space.
Right.
And so that's why I said it's real important that we don't, as far as the remembering goes, that we're not allowing those bad things. I don't say you don't have moments that come up, but when you let them stay in there, they slowly start to push out the good.
Yeah.
Just like let's say you had a good experience at a restaurant. If you read enough Yelp reviews about that same restaurant, you're probably going to walk away from that and it's like, I guess there was something bad that I did have happen in there,
right.
In my experience there. And you hear that enough, it starts to change the way that you think about it.
Right. So we need to hear the good over and over again. And, maybe, I know I've had times in my life where I remember, I shared this on the podcast a couple episodes ago, but I worked at HEB, and I had to be, my dad told me to, I was having a really hard time working there because I was, a teenager and didn't like working. But he was like, retrain the way and fall in love with the idea of working. And now when I think of my times there, I only think of how great they were, right? And I know, there's definitely were times that were like, you could say we're not great. So my question is, the world might consider it foolish to remember something that may not have been that great, but remember the great things about it. Why is that not foolish in the kingdom of God?
Well, because if you think about it, even if overall most of the experience may not have been good, you're taking those moments and you're celebrating those moments during your time, whether you're looking back on it and say, wow, look how I grew through that period of time, which I'm sure some of that happened with you, working at HEB. But it's taking those things and celebrating them.
Yeah.
Working at camp. Camp is hard.
Yeah.
There's long days. It's hot out there, but we're not thinking about that. We're thinking about the great moments that we had where God moved in our life and other people's lives.
Right.
And that's what you're doing.
Right. That's good. That's good. The next C that you have is, you said they create doubt. Let me think of, we talked about this car analogy. Maybe it's foggy. You know what I mean? Like it gets foggy on this road because you start lies start creeping in, and like you said, doubt starts creeping in. So it's like, was that good? Was God there? Did He deliver me from that? What are some different examples on, how doubt is created, but also how we can kick the doubt out, so to say?
Well, I think man, if you think of the children of Israel again, we pick on them so much, but hey, they're in the Bible for a reason. You know, you think of the 12 spies that went in, and Joshua and Caleb gave these 2 reports, and then you had 10 bad reports after that.
Yeah.
They could have been all excited after those first 2, but then they had 10 people that were sowing seeds of doubt into their mind. By the time they were done, they said, there's no way we can go in there.
Right.
All those pieces of doubt started to add up, and it caused them to second guess what God had already promised to them. He said, this land is for you.
Yeah.
And they took the eyewitness of a few people. They allowed the doubt to get in, and it changed. Well, it changed what was going to happen to them for the next several years, because it delayed them going into the promised land. Yeah, it's the same thing with us. Whether it's something that we hear from somebody, you know, their words of doubt, or just maybe a couple of encounters in our life, you know, we allow doubt to creep in there, and it starts to do the work. And then that starts to just have an effect on what we believe.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, Joshua and Caleb for sure. Yeah, if they were the first 2, and then 10 afterwards, you're like, I forget what the first guy. I don't even remember.
Yeah, who was that? Yeah,
it's recency bias too. It's like, I just heard 5 bad ones. It doesn't matter what those were either.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's always refreshing and making sure that, you know, at the forefront of our minds is the good. That's good. The next one you have is that it causes us to rehearse failures, and I can't help but, I'm sure you did this intentionally, but make that also a parallel to, you know, rehearsing your testimony is what we should do. So how are those contradictory? Rehearsing the failure and rehearsing testimony?
Well, you're taking something bad that happened, whether it was your fault or not, doesn't even matter. And you're sitting there and you're going through it in your mind over and over and over and over. And obviously we could use the example of Peter, and we're just having to, by conjecture, just assume that's what he did. Yeah. But it's like, well, we've done it in our own lives. You take something that's a failure, and instead of just moving on from it, you're taking it and going over and over and over. Well, it's already happened. You're not fixing that failure per se. And so why rehearse it? It's not productive. And it goes back to even the very first point, that it starts crowding out your mind space and not allowing the other things in there. Yeah,
that's good. That's good. I think that's important too, you know, just because it is what you rehearse, right? I even think that, you know, that's a good thing to even use that word rehearse, because it's like, what do you rehearse? Things that are important to you, right? And things that you hold value. So why are we holding value in the failure over holding value in the testimony and something that God, you know, has brought us through? That's good. The next one you said is it can erode our trust in Him, and that to me almost parallels with the doubt of just being like, you know, it just, like you said, eroding. So really just chipping away at this idea that we have.
Yeah, it's very, very, very similar. It's just things going on, and lots of times it's just a gradual thing, and we don't even notice how much we slipped there, that it kind of eats away at it. If you think of corrosion, you know, when metal starts to rust, it doesn't rust instantaneously. It's just the exposure to water and air slowly causes that steel to turn into rust, and it's just a slow process, and by the time it's all the way through, you have something that's no longer structurally good. So.
Yeah, right. That's good. Right, exactly. And like you said, it's over time. You know, it's what you keep allowing around it that causes that to happen. Yeah, that's good. And then one of the second last ones was to it makes us careen. And like you said, you had to stretch for this one to make it a C, but it's good. Make it careen off the path that God has for us. And also, like you said, or like we said about the rehearse one, it makes me think of the redirect as well, right? You need a redirection when you go off the path, right? And that's why, you know, we should forget, you know, because these things that we do forget, they get at the wheel, right? You hear Jesus take the wheel, right? But we let other things at the wheel. And then now either those things are driving, or we're paying attention and distracted. And so we do go off the path.
Yeah. And if you go off the path, let's say you're driving a car and you go down the ditch. Well, you don't just sit there and continue driving the ditch. You want to do whatever you can to get back on the path as soon as possible. And it's the same thing with us. If we see that we're going off in those areas, it's just us course correcting. Yeah. And I even gave the example of, you know, even if you're driving down a straight road for miles and miles, you still have small course corrections in there. The steering wheel's not locked in. You're doing small things to keep it on that course.
Yes, for sure. Right. Because, like you said, it may not be a whole like the car flipped 6 times, and you know,
you're not going over the cliff.
Right.
Like
it could be like, you know, you as you're driving, you might just need to just monitor the wheel and always keep an eye on that, because, like you said, sometimes we always go to the most drastic version, but they're just small things too to look out for, That's good. That's why there's these signs along the way that say, watch out for this and watch out for this.
Yeah, or the rumble strips on the side of the road. Why are they there? They remind you that, hey, you're getting out of your lane. You need to go back.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And so the last C, you said it is capable of blinding us to the freedom available to us. And then I think you said blind spots, right? Having these different blind spots. So what do you mean by blind spots?
Well, lots of times when you're so wrapped up in what's wrong, at some point in areas in your life, you probably had a freedom, and when you start looking at what's wrong, you tend not to see that freedom anymore. It's still there, but you're not seeing it.
Right.
And if you're not seeing it long enough, you're not gonna walk in that freedom.
Yeah.
And I think that's lots of times what happened. It may not be an overall blind, I can't see any freedom in my life. Lots of times it's just certain areas where it's a blind spot that you see that, and you just get off into where it's like, oh yeah, you know what, God has promised me freedom in that area, and I haven't been walking in that. And I need to do that.
Okay, now this is fun. I want to ask you this question because I don't know if you noticed it, but there's a lot of car analogies through this message. I don't know what it is. So I'm gonna list a couple of them, but you talk about remembering redirects us, how sometimes we're careening off the path. You said there's blind spots to freedom, but it also, I threw this one in there, you didn't say this one, but I also think of driving down memory lane, right? Yeah. And remembering. So what is the comparison? Why is it so easy to compare driving on a road and a vehicle to take the shape of remembrance? What do you think that is that makes those two so there's so many parts of driving that you can point back to remembrance?
Well, you think about it, you're engaging your senses. Yeah. You're engaging your eyes, lots of times what you hear around you, different things that you use to be able to do this driving task. It's the same in our walk with God. We need to be engaging. What are we seeing or what are we hearing? Obviously sometimes it's with our physical eyes, what we're doing in there, but our spiritual eyes, what are we putting in? Are we reading the word? Are we doing that? What are we hearing? Are we hearing whether it's coming from the pulpit, what we're doing in our worship time, or even from the people around us, or do we have godly influence around us that's speaking good things into our life? Yeah. It's the same thing. You're engaging senses that allow you to be able to continue on this path.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I just thought it was funny. A couple of messages ago, Pastor Steph had a lot of, she talked about the mind. There was a lot of war analogies. It was like, there's these tiny soldiers that, show up every single day, and the battle of your mind and all of these things, and holding your thoughts captive. It was kind of the same parallel of being like, I guess this is just a good thing to compare it to, like you said, engaging your senses. Those parallel in both of those.
Yeah.
And then so towards the end of your message, you kind of give a little bit of an activation of how to forget the bad and remember the good. And you addressed a little bit earlier. You said, stay in His Word, remember who you are in Christ. His voice, but as also as knowing His voice, you ignore the wrong voices. You share your testimony, and you walk in love. And I thought that was those are some good points. I don't know if you had anything to add or take away from any of those.
Well, and you had asked about testimony stuff a few minutes ago, and I guess I kind of glazed over it, but I kind of want to talk about that for a minute. Yes, we don't want to rehearse the failures, but we want to rehearse our testimonies. And there's a couple of things. First of all, we need to remember that our testimony is not just for us. Yes, it's an example of what God did in our lives, but it's also there for other people. Yeah. And so we have a responsibility to share that. Right. And second of all, we have to remember that everybody's testimony is different. If I took all the people that were in service on Sunday, their testimony affects different people in different ways. My testimony would not, there's a certain amount of people it would reach, but then somebody else in there, they would have it that would affect a totally different sphere of influence. And so I think it's real important that we learn how to, first of all, remember that testimony and rehearse it, but then that should make it where we can share that testimony. Yeah. And it's not like somebody's testimony is more important or better than somebody else's. My testimony and Pastor Al's testimony were drastically different, but they also affect different people. Right. And I think lots of times there was somebody I talked to after service that day that talked about how I think I'm finally getting to the point where I'm ready to share my testimony. It's like, well, Be ready at any time to share your testimony, because you don't know, and I think I mentioned this a few minutes ago, God's going to open the doors when you're willing to bring people across your path that you can share your testimony with.
Yeah.
And I think it's our responsibility as Christ followers to always be ready with that testimony, because people can read the word and everything else, and that is important. Spend their, coming to church and spending that time in worship. But lots of times when you give that testimony, it's something that's catered exactly to that person that you're talking to at that time. And it's allowing God to speak through you into that person's life in a way that can reach them.
Yeah, that's good. Because, and I think too, a lot of that is, you feel the nudge of the Holy Spirit, right?
Yes.
And like in that moment, you're like, are you asking me? Holy Spirit, are you asking me to share that again? Like, I've shared that a million times. Everyone in this room has heard it, but either, someone hasn't, or someone needs to be reminded. So I think that's good too, because like you said, it's not for us a lot of the times.
Yes.
We do, it is a byproduct, because sharing your testimony, you remind yourself of what God did, right? But also it's igniting other people too. That's really good. Yeah. And you share the, I think you said, Pastor Kevin said this quote about like, you can't hold a grudge and pray for someone at the same time.
Yeah, he said it's very hard to hold a grudge against somebody that you're praying for.
Right.
He said, because when you do that, it goes back to what I was talking about, something crowding out something else.
Right.
If you're spending your time praying for that person, all that, whether it's an offense or something else you picked up or unforgiveness, that gets shoved off to the side because you're looking at them from a God perspective.
Yeah. That's
good.
Really
important.
Right. And like you said, how does that start? Like how can you start looking at things that way? Well, you forget about all the ideas that you have, right? And like you said too, with our spiritual eyes, see them the way that God sees them, so that you can quit, us as humans, like you said, the human nature, you're just holding a grudge based on, what we can see. But if you see all the cards, like, God's holding all the cards, and you look through his eyes for a moment, you'll realize, that like, they're just like you. The thing that you hold a grudge on, that doesn't matter. What does matter is that, they need, something from you, that you can, pray for them, and you can't let that grudge hold you back.
Right.
That's good. And then the last thing, maybe I just want you just to close, kind of how you close in the message, just, talking about, because I just love it, the Peter reconciliation that Jesus had.
Yeah. Well, Jesus came back, and when you start reading in John, there's the time where Jesus is on the beach and they're out there fishing. And it says this is actually the third time he had appeared to the disciples. And so he tells Peter to cast the net on the other side, and they come back to shore. And so Jesus is there preparing breakfast, and they have their time together where they're eating. And he asks, Peter, do you love me? And he says, yes, I love you. And he said, well, feed my sheep. And I wish we knew this part somehow. It's like, I got to thinking about that when I was reading the other day. It's like, how did the first two encounters with Jesus go? Because it said it's the third time appearing to the disciples. So I'm assuming Peter was there both those times.
I didn't catch that. That's interesting.
Was there not any one-on-one conversation? He just came into the room.
And was that killing Peter? That he didn't have that.
It's like, okay, so he ignored me again. Fine.
Right.
And so whatever happened there, but this time he specifically was talking to Peter. And then he asked him again, do you love me? And the translation I used the other day, the second time he said, feed my lambs. He asked him one more time. And by that time, the way Peter's answering, you can tell he's kind of exasperated. Like, why? You know me. Right. And you're asking me a third time if I love you. And he says, you know that I love you. And he said, feed my sheep. And I think this is just my take on it. I think that it was just him reminding him that, Peter, I know that you love me, but here's what I'm telling you to do. And what I didn't share was there's actually two scriptures after that. He even goes to the point where he's telling Peter the way that he's going to finish out his life. After he does a work for God. And we know Peter, he was so honored to be an apostle that when it was they were ready to crucify him, he said, I'm not even worthy to die like my Lord. Crucify me upside down. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot you could read into that. That shows the way that he wanted to honor Jesus. Yeah. Excuse me. And just to show him his devotion to him until the very end. And that there was obviously a change in mindset, because if you read the book of Acts, especially the first half, excuse me, I'm sorry.
You're good.
It shows what Peter did. And Peter was one of the primary people responsible for the revolution that started with the new church.
Yeah.
Once Jesus died, we were under a new covenant, and he got such a revelation of that he was just part of the fire that spread through the world at that time.
Yeah.
With the new church that came into being, and so obviously he had to have a radical change from whatever mindset of failure he had after the encounter with Jesus before Jesus was crucified to where he was then, because it was just. They did some crazy stuff when they were with Jesus, but he told them they would do greater things. And they fulfilled that in the book of Acts. And so there was something that happened there, that there was a true restoration with Jesus. Whenever he came back and he had that encounter with him. And so everything that was there, whatever kind of doubt, all the other things we talked about that were problem areas, that he fixed those. And he was able to walk in the call of God on his life, which was a huge thing. I mean, you're responsible for an entire movement like that, a revolution that started because of people like you.
Right.
That's radical.
Yes, for sure. And I just love the timing of it. I love that it comes after, like you said, further in that passage that he ends up telling Peter about all the things that he's going to be able to do through him after, this moment where Peter thought, not that Peter thought that all was lost, but thought that he really, had upset Jesus, or, that, which is a funny mindset in its own. But to, feel like, so like, oh, I've let him down. And then Jesus like really pull him aside, put his hand on his shoulder and say, listen, not only do I forgive you, but I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do through you going forward. Like I said, I think the timing of that is just so good. And I also like what you said. You said a line on here where you were like, on as far as that whole situation went, on Jesus' side and Peter's side, he thought this way, but on Jesus' side, the relationship was never broken, right? It makes me think, how many times that we feel like that we've disappointed God, or we've disappointed, or we've fallen short, in that, we have this messed up idea that God's mad at us. But it's like the prodigal son, the father's arms are open wide, waiting for you to run home. And I think that's really good. And it starts with, I think also the story of the prodigal son, when he's with the pigs, right? He starts remembering about, his life before that, right? And he starts remembering about like, well, my life was like this, and surely maybe he would take me back, and, I know it's kind of a little bit off topic, but it just makes me think of remembering too, and then him just running back home, because that relationship was never broken, no matter what he saw, or going back to Peter, what Peter thought was happening. That relationship was always strong through there. I thought that was good. Yeah,
if you think about it, it's true. Jesus' perspective of the relationship never changed, and so he had to help Peter to change his perspective. But if you take that example, we can carry that into our everyday walk, our relationships with one another. If we can learn to see each other through Jesus's eyes, then that keeps those things that may become an offense, or some other rejection, whatever it may be, it keeps those things from creeping in. If we can learn to view each other in those same eyes.
It's I know it's not the same thing, but also makes me think of the Pastor Kevin analogy of the cup and the water with the mud, right? And how if this, how do you get this? We talked about it on the podcast before, but how do you get this cup, full of mud out? Like, you can scrape it, but there's still gonna be remnants in there. But if you stick a hose in there, well, then that water is gonna clean it out. And it's almost like the same thing goes with, our concepts and our minds and our memories, right? If that mud is all of the disdain and pain and all the things that we remember, but if this movement of God's and these memories of and this gratitude and this thankfulness and this good look at the past, you put that water in there and that'll clean it out. And now, like, you're full of what you should be full of in life and things like that too. So I think that's just a good way too.
Yeah.
So as far as your message goes, maybe if the readers want to jump into more remembrance, where are you pulling from in the Bible, and where's maybe some place where people could go deeper and do some more research in if they wanted to continue along this thought?
Well, I think, first of all, taking those two primary stories I used, which was really just kind of the story of Joseph. We did talk about the children of Israel with the memorial stones, but somebody that was actually having to walk it out was Joseph and then the story of Peter. And obviously with Peter, you could read through some of that in a couple of different Gospels. But I think reading through those two, and then there was a lot of stuff that I shared actually from the book of Philippians, and it's where Paul was talking about, he talked about putting those things behind and pressing forward and things to think on. It's real good in the book of Philippians where it talks about that. And I think those are things that can help you to get a better understanding of that. And what you can do if you're having trouble remembering the wrong things. I think that can help you with it.
So the story of Joseph, the story of Peter, the book of Philippians, and in your own life, what God's done for you too. That's a good one too. So Pastor Rod, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely.
If you guys want to check out the full message, it's on YouTube. It is called Don't Forget to Remember, and we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for listening. If you want to check out full messages, you can find us at LS Church on all podcast platforms, and you can watch full services with worship at LS Church Alvin on YouTube.